The Thin White Duke finally died in Berlin, though the death wasn't as dramatic or public as Ziggy Stardust's staged retirement. Bowie fled to Berlin in late 1976, desperate to escape Los Angeles and the scandals the Duke had created. And in that divided city surrounded by the Berlin Wall, he began the slow process of killing the character through discipline and deprivation. No more cocaine meant no more chemical fuel for the Duke's cold intensity. Structured days of routine and normal living meant no more space for the Duke's theatrical pronouncements and disturbing political statements. And the creation of the Low album, with its minimalist sound and emotional honesty, represented a deliberate artistic rejection of everything the Duke had stood for. But killing the Duke wasn't as simple as deciding to stop performing him. The character had been so consuming, so total in his possession of Bowie's personality, that its removal left a void that was almost as disturbing as the possession itself. Bowie in Berlin was cold, depressed, emotionally flat, as if the Duke had burned out his capacity to feel genuine warmth or connection. The question that haunted those early Berlin months was whether Bowie had killed the Duke, or whether the Duke, in dying, had taken essential parts of David Jones with him, leaving behind someone who was alive but hollowed out, surviving but not quite whole. If you want to discover how David Bowie's most dangerous character nearly destroyed him, subscribe to our channel now, because The Thin White Duke was possession disguised as performance. The Thin White Duke emerged in late 1975 during the final stages of recording the Station to Station album, but the seeds had been planted months earlier during Bowie's catastrophic cocaine period in Los Angeles. Unlike his previous characters, which were carefully designed and deliberately constructed, the Duke seemed to appear without conscious planning, as if he had been waiting inside Bowie for the right conditions to manifest. Those conditions were perfect by late 1975. Bowie was consuming 3 grams of cocaine daily. His weight had dropped to 95 pounds. He was obsessed with Aleister Crowley and occult rituals. He believed demons watched him through mirrors, and his grip on reality had become so tenuous that distinguishing between David Bowie the performer and David Jones, the person, had become nearly impossible. Into this psychological void stepped the Duke, a character who was cold, where Bowie had been warm, authoritarian, where Bowie had been liberating, emotionless, where Bowie had been passionate. The Duke's aesthetic was deliberately stark and minimalist, a rejection of the glitter and theatricality that had characterized Bowie's previous personas. He wore simple black and white clothing, white shirts, black vests, black trousers, with his hair slicked back and no makeup beyond his naturally pale, skeletal appearance. The simplicity was both practical and symbolic. Practically, Bowie was too exhausted and malnourished to sustain elaborate costume changes or theatrical performances. Symbolically, the Duke represented a stripping away of everything decorative and human, leaving only the cold essence of performance, without genuine emotion. Where Ziggy Stardust had been colorful and alien, where Aladdin Sane had been fractured and theatrical, the Duke was monochrome and mechanical, performing humanity without actually experiencing it. This wasn't artistic choice, so much as accurate representation of what Bowie had become during his cocaine addiction, a person who had lost access to genuine feeling and was simply going through the motions of being alive. The most controversial and disturbing aspect of the Thin White Duke was his flirtation with fascist imagery and authoritarian ideas. The Duke's black and white aesthetic evoked SS uniforms, though with enough ambiguity that it could be denied or rationalized. His gestures on stage were sharp and angular, sometimes looking uncomfortably close to Nazi salutes, though again with enough plausible deniability that intentionality remained unclear. And his between-song monologues during the Station to Station tour increasingly referenced ideas from Nietzsche about the Übermensch, spoke admiringly about the need for strong leadership, and expressed fascination with authoritarian aesthetics and crowd control. Music journalists who covered these concerts found themselves in uncomfortable territory, unable to determine whether Bowie was critiquing fascism through performance or actually expressing genuine sympathy for these ideas. The truth was more complicated and more disturbing than either interpretation suggested. Bowie's cocaine paranoia had led him down rabbit holes of occult research that included studying Nazi mysticism and propaganda techniques. He had become obsessed with Leni Riefenstahl's films, watching them repeatedly and praising their aesthetic power, while his drug-addled mind lost the ability to maintain critical distance from their content. He spoke about Hitler in interviews, calling him a rock star and one of the first people to use media manipulation on a massive scale, statements that were technically accurate, but dangerously ambiguous in their admiration. And the Duke, as a character, seemed to embody these fascinations without the ironic distance or critical framework that would have made clear this was artistic exploration rather than genuine political belief. The problem was that Bowie himself had lost the ability to maintain that critical distance, and the Duke was speaking through him without a clear filter between character and person. The moment when the Thin White Duke's dangerous ambiguity became national scandal occurred on May 2, 1976, at Victoria Station in London. Bowie had returned to Britain for promotional appearances related to the Station to Station album, and a crowd of fans had gathered to welcome him. As his open-top Mercedes slowly made its way through the station forecourt, Bowie stood in the back of the car and raised his arm to wave at the fans. But the angle of the gesture, captured by multiple photographers, looked disturbingly like a Nazi salute. Whether this was intentional provocation, accidental positioning, or cocaine-induced loss of motor control remained disputed. But the photographs were unambiguous and explosive. British newspapers ran the images on front pages with headlines asking whether Bowie was a fascist sympathizer, and the backlash was immediate and severe. Bowie's initial response to the scandal was confused and inconsistent, which only made things worse. He claimed he had simply been waving, that the photograph was misleading, that he was exhausted from travel and his movements had been awkward. But these explanations satisfied almost no one, particularly given the context of his recent statements and the Duke's increasingly disturbing stage persona. The truth, which Bowie himself barely understood at the time, was that the Duke had been in control during that moment, and Bowie couldn't clearly remember his own intentions because his cocaine-damaged memory and the character's possession of his personality had made reliable self-knowledge impossible. The scandal forced Bowie to confront what he had become, to recognize that the Duke wasn't just performance, but had become his default mode of existence, and that continuing on this path would destroy not just his career, but his life. In the aftermath of Victoria Station, during the final weeks before fleeing to Berlin, Bowie began to understand the full extent of what had happened to him. The Duke wasn't a character he was playing. It was a personality that had emerged from his cocaine psychosis and taken control of his body, while David Jones retreated further and further into some internal space from which he could only watch in horror. Friends and colleagues who spent time with Bowie during this period described someone who seemed split, whose personality would shift mid-conversation from recognizably Bowie to something cold and alien that used his voice but expressed ideas and attitudes that felt completely foreign. The Duke would appear without warning, and Bowie had lost the ability to prevent these appearances or to maintain awareness during them. Hours would pass where the Duke was in control, and Bowie would have only fragmentary memories of what had been said or done. This wasn't multiple personality disorder in any clinical sense, but rather the result of severe cocaine abuse combined with the psychological strain of maintaining public personas for years, all crashing together into a state where Bowie's sense of self had become so fragmented that another personality could occupy the space he had abandoned. The Duke represented everything Bowie had been running from: coldness, emotional distance, the worship of power and control, fascist aesthetics, but also everything that cocaine and fame had made him become. The drug had stripped away his warmth and empathy, leaving only the cold efficiency of performance. Fame had trained him to be something other than human, to exist as image and symbol rather than person. And the Duke was the culmination of these forces, a character that was both creation and creator, both mask and face, both performance and reality so intertwined that separation had become impossible. The decision to leave Los Angeles and move to Berlin was both practical necessity and symbolic rebirth. Practically, Bowie needed to escape the cocaine supply and the enablers and the music industry pressures that had created conditions for the Duke's emergence. Berlin offered anonymity, distance from the English-speaking media, and a city where he could disappear and focus on survival rather than performance. Symbolically, Berlin was itself a divided city, split by the wall into East and West, communist and capitalist, representing the kind of division Bowie felt within himself between David Jones and the Duke. Moving to Berlin was moving into a physical representation of his own psychological state, and perhaps that recognition would make healing possible. The early months in Berlin were about establishing routines that left no space for the Duke to manifest. Wake at reasonable hours, eat regular meals, bicycle through the city, visit museums, read books, go to sleep at normal times. These simple activities, which most people take for granted, were revolutionary for someone who had spent years living on cocaine and irregular hours. The discipline was both necessary and excruciating, because without the chemical energy of cocaine, Bowie was confronted with the depression and exhaustion that the drug had been masking. The Duke had felt no emotions, and now that the Duke was being starved out of existence, Bowie found himself feeling too much. Grief, shame, fear, loneliness, all the accumulated emotional debris from years of running from himself through drugs and characters and constant reinvention. The Low album, recorded in late 1976 and early 1977 between France and Berlin, represented Bowie's attempt to create music that was the opposite of everything the Duke had represented. Where the Duke had been polished and perfect, Low was raw and fragmented. Where the Duke had performed emotion without feeling it, Low was emotionally honest to the point of being uncomfortable. Where the Duke had been verbose and theatrical, Low was minimalist and often wordless. The album's structure reflected Bowie's fractured psychological state, the first side containing short, incomplete-feeling songs that barely exceeded 3 minutes. The second side, entirely instrumental ambient pieces that sounded like the interior landscape of depression. This wasn't music designed to be commercially successful or even particularly enjoyable. It was music as psychological documentation, as evidence that David Jones still existed somewhere inside the wreckage the Duke had created. Producer Tony Visconti, who had worked with Bowie on earlier albums, was shocked by the transformation when they began the Low sessions. The skeletal figure was physically healthier than during the Los Angeles period, but emotionally he seemed hollow, as if something essential had been removed. Bowie spoke about the Duke in the past tense, but also with uncertainty, as if he couldn't be completely sure the character was gone, as if he feared that any moment of weakness or chemical temptation might allow the Duke to return and finish what he had started. The recording process became a kind of therapy, with Bowie using music to prove to himself that he could still create, could still feel, could still be David Jones, rather than just a vessel for whatever character wanted to use his body. The fact that the resulting album was cold and minimal wasn't failure. It was honest representation of someone who had survived possession but was still recovering the capacity for warmth. Killing the thin white Duke took longer than creating him had. The character had emerged over months of cocaine use and psychological deterioration, and erasing him required months of sobriety and deliberate reconstruction of self. Bowie described the process years later as similar to exorcism, as if he had been possessed by something that needed to be driven out through discipline and denial of everything it fed on. No cocaine meant no chemical fuel for the Duke's cold intensity. No theatrical performances meant no stage on which the Duke could manifest. No interviews about politics or philosophy meant no platform for the Duke's disturbing pronouncements. And perhaps most importantly, the creation of deeply personal, emotionally vulnerable music meant occupying the creative space that the Duke had colonized, reclaiming it for David Jones. But the Duke's death wasn't complete or clean. Parts of the character remained embedded in Bowie's personality, visible in moments of coldness or emotional distance that would surface even decades later. Friends and collaborators who knew Bowie for the rest of his life would occasionally see flashes of something that reminded them of the Duke, a particular tone of voice, a gesture, a way of looking at the world with detached calculation rather than genuine engagement. These weren't full manifestations of the character, but rather scar tissue, permanent marks left by the period when the Duke had possessed him so completely. Bowie learned to live with these remnants, to recognize them when they appeared, and consciously choose different behavior, but they never fully disappeared. The Duke had been too total, too consuming, had occupied Bowie's personality too completely to be erased without leaving permanent damage. The Thin White Duke remains the most controversial of David Bowie's characters, the one that fans and critics still struggle to discuss or rationalize decades after his death. Unlike Ziggy Stardust or Aladdin Sane, which can be celebrated as artistic achievements and cultural milestones, the Duke represents Bowie's darkest moment, the period when his genius crossed into something dangerous and his influence became potentially harmful. The Victoria Station incident, the fascist flirtations, the cold authoritarianism. These cannot be simply dismissed as misunderstood art or excused as the price of experimentation. They were real. They caused real harm to Bowie's reputation and to the people who trusted him, and they represented genuine moral failing, even if that failing was rooted in addiction and mental illness rather than sincere political belief. But the Duke also demonstrates something important about the relationship between art and identity, between performance and reality, between the characters we create and the people we actually are. Bowie's experience with the Duke showed that you cannot play with darkness without risking being consumed by it. That ironic distance is fragile and can collapse under the weight of fame and addiction. That the masks we wear can become our faces if we're not vigilant about the distinction. The fact that Bowie survived, that he recognized what was happening and made the difficult choice to flee to Berlin and kill the Duke through discipline and deprivation, makes the story ultimately one of recovery rather than just destruction. But it's recovery that acknowledges what was lost, that doesn't pretend the damage wasn't real or lasting. Years later, when asked about the Thin White Duke period, Bowie would speak with a mixture of shame and distance, acknowledging what had happened, while also making clear he could barely recognize himself in that person. He described it as the closest he came to not surviving his own artistic ambitions, to being destroyed by the same creativity and willingness to take risks that had made him successful. The Duke represented what happened when all of Bowie's tendencies toward reinvention and character creation met cocaine psychosis and fame-induced disconnection from reality, creating something that was both Bowie's creation and his potential destroyer. The character nearly killed him, nearly destroyed his reputation, nearly turned artistic genius into fascist propaganda, and only the combination of scandal and genuine fear for his own survival prompted the escape to Berlin that made recovery possible. The thin white Duke died in Berlin, starved out of existence through sobriety and routine, but his ghost haunted Bowie for the rest of his life. The experience taught Bowie about the limits of artistic experimentation and the dangers of losing yourself in performance, lessons that informed his work for the next 40 years. He never again created a character that he couldn't clearly separate from his own identity. He never again lost himself so completely in a persona that he couldn't distinguish his own thoughts from the characters. And he remained vigilant until his death about maintaining the boundary between David Bowie, the public figure, and David Jones, the private person, understanding that the Duke had shown how easily that boundary could collapse and how catastrophic the consequences could be. The Duke's death in Berlin was the beginning of Bowie's second act, the period when he became not just an artist, but a survivor, someone who had looked into the abyss of his own darkness and chosen to step back rather than jump.